One thing that I tell to a lot of my younger colleagues is there's a tendency to think that there's a secret manual somewhere. And if somebody just gives you the secret manual, then things are going to be solved. And the senior people all have the secret manual that they keep and they won't let anybody else know. And the truth is there is no secret manual. Basically, one of the great things about being in science is that most scientists are essentially high-functioning sociopaths. So we don't have norms, we don't really have conventions. If you do something eccentric and weird and strange with sufficient conviction, that will stand you in good stead in science. So you don't, and I think young women perhaps particularly feel like, what's the rules? What's the secret? What's the things that I'm supposed to be, what are the things that I'm supposed to be doing? And the answer is you really can genuinely, truly make your own rules in academia. And if you just do it with enough conviction, you can persuade people that those are the rules that everybody else should follow too. So here's what I call the parable of SRCD, because SRCD is the Society for Research in Child Development, which is the big developmental conference. But it applies to Flux, it could apply to any conference. And here's the parable. The parable is, the first time you come to the big conference when you're a graduate student, you think, gee, this is great, I'm gonna meet all the famous people and impress them. And what happens is you show up at the conference, all the famous people are talking to each other, they completely snub you and ignore you. And you're really depressed. So you go off and you have a bunch of drinks with the other graduate students and you complain about how horribly all the famous people are treating you. Now the next year you've actually published a paper. So you think this year it's gonna be different because I actually have that paper out there. No, you show up exactly the same. The famous people talk to each other. You go off and at least you get to have drinks with the same graduate students you had drinks with last year. Finally, you become a faculty member and you think this year is going to be different. This is going to be the good year. You show up, the famous people all snub you, and at least you get to see your friends who used to be graduate students who now are also faculty, and you get to catch up and see what was happening and so forth. Now, the thing that you don't realize is this will never change. There's only one thing that will happen. 1 year after you get tenure, you're going to say to your partner, you know what, this year I'm just going to forget about the famous people. I'm just going to go, I'm going to forget about trying to impress someone, I'm going to see my old friends, I'm going to find out how they're all doing, I'll spend my time talking to them, and I'll just forget about being ambitious. You show up at the conference, there's your old friends, you go to talk to them, and what happens? There's a bunch of kids who keep interrupting you and pulling on your sleeve and trying to get in the way. So even when you think you've figured out how to deal with SRCD, you're still kind of stuck. In a funny way, for me, I've always had other jobs than being a scientist because I started my career in philosophy and I still am an affiliate professor in philosophy. So about half of my work still is what I think of as being essentially applied philosophy. And to me, it seems naturally, in some ways, more a philosopher than a scientist, although I love actually doing the science. So I started out as a philosopher, then I became deeply involved in the science, and more recently I've done a lot of writing, sort of science communication and public intellectual work. So that's something else that I like to do. I like to think about the big picture, the way that philosophers do, and I love to write, so that's something else that I do. But it has occurred to me, of all the jobs that I do, the job of caregiving, taking care of children, which I started doing because I was the oldest sister of 6, I've done all my life, it's really been the most profound job that I've ever done. So I think I could have led a very happy life as a children's librarian. The idea of being surrounded by children's books and children reading them is kind of my idea of heaven. Now, probably if I'd done that, I would have been spending my time thinking that being a scientist would be heaven, but that's certainly an alternative life I can imagine. One of the people that I was a senior person when I was coming up, who I look up to a great deal, is John Flavel, who is now retired, but was really the first person to introduce Piaget to the American public, and was a National Academy of Sciences investigator and scientist. And part of why I looked up to him so much, he was temperamentally completely the opposite of me. So he was from Minnesota, and he was always incredibly sweet and incredibly generous, and you never heard a critical word from him. And he would kind of get up at conferences in his cardigan and he would say, you know, Ellie and I were thinking and we thought maybe we should try this with the 3-year-olds. And then he'd come up with something that was unbelievably profound and theoretically deep and philosophically broad, and just blew away everybody, you know, all the ambitious 30-year-olds in the room. The only problem was, when I was very young and starting out, I had a seminar with him that was one of the great experiences. We would drive back and forth from Berkeley to Stanford. Was when I was just starting. The only trouble was he was so reasonable and tolerant that I would come home with these terrible headaches, because the inhibition of having to be good and nice and sweet and calm and reasonable for an entire 2 hours was so exhausting for a young Philadelphia Jewish intellectual just arriving in California, that I was completely exhausted. But it definitely taught me some important lessons about how you could be, and how you could be in the philosophical and psychological world and do really profound things, and be nice at the same time. Well, my experience, and I think the experience of a lot of people, has been I do best when I have trainees who are coming from lots of different disciplines. So in my lab, for instance, I've had people who are coming from philosophy, people who are coming from computer science, some people who've never seen or worked with a child before, some who hadn't done psychology before. And the very fact that people come from a wide range of different backgrounds and are interested in a lot of different things is a real advantage. And one of the things I always say is, you know, there's this kind of explore-exploit trade-off is what people talk about technically. You can get students who are incredibly creative, but kind of all over the map, or you can get students who are kind of narrow, much more narrowly focused, but can do a lot in that narrow focus. And I used to think, and I think this is still true, of course, if someone's narrow, it's very hard to get them to be broad, but if they start out being kind of all over the place, then it's possible to get them to narrow down. So I always think we should go with the we should go with the foxes instead of the hedgehogs. But that's what I started out thinking. I also have to say that after all of these years, I've somewhat changed my mind about that, not in the sense that I still don't think the foxes and the creative types are really important, but I'm struck more and more by how much in science is just put one foot in front of another. It's sit down every morning and do something, and then sit down the next morning and do something else. And again, another piece of advice I would give is if you can just go, at the end of the day, instead of thinking about all the things that you were supposed to do that you didn't do, you can think, I did this one thing. And you just do one thing every day for 40 years, and you'll have produced a lot of science. So I'm a little more impressed now than I once was by the merits of just good, steady, hard, productive work, as opposed to genius and brilliance, which was what I was more impressed by when I was young. Best of all is if you can have both. So it's tricky about who's going to be the best mentors, and there's a kind of trade-off. So often if you find the senior famous person, chances are they're going to be incredibly busy, have a million postdocs and graduate students already, and you'll have the advantage of the fame and resources, but maybe not as much attention. If you get a very junior person, you're more likely to get real undivided attention and mentorship. You won't have the advantage of as many connections. So probably sort of somewhere in between is best. Often I've been impressed by how well my undergrads have done with younger faculty rather than the sort of obvious senior stars who you might look for. The other thing that I think is important is to have a sense of the range of work that the person does. So our setup with graduate education has really changed in the 30 years since I was a graduate student. Increasingly, the pressure on faculty is to say, okay, here's my grant, here's the 7 things that I put in my grant, here's 7 graduate students, each of you is going to do a piece of my project. And that's a good way to start, but you'd really like to have a mentor who's willing to say, think of something of your own, find out something that you're going to do off your own bat, because it's those things that are really going to be what people are looking for when you're out trying to be an independent investigator. And again, this may just be the cranky old woman, but it seems to me that we've ended up often having people who are coming in who've done 3 postdocs and 7 years of graduate school, and they've never had a chance to really formulate their own problem, think about it, and implement it themselves. And that's really what you need to do if you're going to be a graduate student. Jerome Bruner was actually my thesis mentor famous, wonderful cognitive and developmental psychologist. Also famous for having incredibly successful students. His list of students is sort of like a who's who of developmental psychology. And when we were all graduate students, none of us would do what Jerry told us to do. And it's tremendously to Jerry's credit that he let us all do all the different things that we were doing. So, you know, as graduate students, Andy Meltzoff was in the lab going out and doing infant imitation, which wasn't something that Jerry was directly interested in. Alan Leslie was in the lab doing things about causality. I was doing things about language and thought. And when we look back, we can all see, oh, wait a minute, all these were influenced by the kinds of things that Jerry was interested in, but it was very different than his telling us, here's the things that you should